The CEO's daughter fired me on her first day. A month later, she was begging for my help. The morning Richard Carson was gone, I wore black not out of prescience, but because it was Tuesday. Tuesdays were when I met with our overseas suppliers, and black conveyed the right balance of authority and approachability. I'd spent 12 years perfecting these little details, the invisible architecture that kept Carson Enterprises thriving while its founder got all the credit. I was in the middle of a video call with our textile supplier in Vietnam when the news ricocheted through the office. Heart attack. No warning. Just gone. For 2 weeks, we moved like sleepwalkers. Richard had been more than a boss. He'd been the company's beating heart. I kept the logistics department running on autopilot, making sure shipments flowed, while executives whispered behind closed doors about succession plans. The consensus was simple. Carson's daughter Ivy would step in temporarily while the board searched for a permanent CEO. I'd met Ivy exactly twice. Once at the company Christmas party 3 years ago, where she'd glanced at my hand when I introduced myself as if checking for a ring that wasn't there. The second time was at a product launch where she spent more time on her phone than watching her father unveil the work he'd spent months perfecting. So when they announced her arrival as acting CEO, I tempered my expectations. What I couldn't have predicted was how thoroughly she would exceed them, in the worst possible way. On her first official day, I arrived at 7 a.m. as usual. The office was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. By 8:30, a memo had circulated. All department heads were to gather in the main conference room at 10 a.m. sharp. "What do you think she wants?" asked Terrence from accounting, catching me by the coffee machine. I shrugged, stirring creamer into my cup. "Probably just introductions. Give her time to adjust." Terrence's laugh was hollow. "Have you seen her Instagram? The woman runs with sharks. Literally. There's a photo of her cage diving with great whites in South Africa. She doesn't adjust, she conquers." I dismissed his anxiety with a wave. "She's 29 and has never run a company. She'll need allies, not enemies." 3 hours later, I would recall that conversation with bitter irony. The conference room filled quickly. I took my usual seat, third from the left, notepad ready. When Ivy walked in, the shift was palpable. The air seemed to crystallize around her. She didn't look like someone grieving. Her slate gray suit was impeccably tailored, her dark hair pulled into a sleek ponytail that emphasized her sharp cheekbones. She wore the kind of confidence that comes from never having truly failed at anything. "Good morning," she began, her voice cool and controlled. "I know many of you expected my father's shoes to be filled by someone older, someone with decades of corporate experience." Her pause was theatrical. But Carson Enterprises doesn't need more of the same. It needs evolution. For 40 minutes, she outlined her vision. Aggressive expansion into emerging markets, a complete digital overhaul, and streamlined operations. It all sounded impressive in theory, buzzwords strung together like Christmas lights. But I'd been in this business long enough to recognize when someone was reading from a script they didn't fully understand. Then she said 6 words that changed everything, which brings me to the restructuring plan. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Some departments are running on outdated models. Logistics, for example. Her gaze locked onto me, glacier cold. "Miranda Parker, isn't it?" I nodded, suddenly aware of 20 pairs of eyes swiveling toward me. "You've been with my father's company for how long?" 12 years, Miss Carson." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "And in those 12 years, has your department undergone any significant technological upgrades?" The question was a trap, and we both knew it. Our systems were functional, but not flashy. Richard had always prioritized reliability over novelty. "We've implemented several incremental improvements," I began carefully. "Our current." "Incremental," she interrupted. "That's precisely the problem. This company doesn't need incremental. It needs revolutionary." She tapped her tablet, and suddenly the wall screen behind her displayed a PowerPoint slide labeled Immediate Personnel Changes. My name was at the top. "Miranda Parker, effective immediately. Your position is being eliminated. We'll be bringing in a supply chain automation team that specializes in AI-driven logistics management." The room went so quiet I could hear the air conditioning humming. Someone gasped softly. I don't understand, I stammered, heat rising in my cheeks. Our vendor relationships are built on personal connections. We have exclusive agreements with 26 suppliers across 3 continents. Ivy's expression hardened. Relationships? This isn't a social club, Miss Parker. It's a business. And frankly, you represent everything that's holding us back. Dead weight in a pantsuit, clinging to outdated methods because they're comfortable. The cruelty was so unexpected, so public, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. 12 years of dedication, dismissed in seconds by someone who'd never spent a day in my department. She continued, her voice clinical. HR will process your severance package. Please clear your desk by noon. I looked around the table. Some colleagues stared at their hands. Others watched with the horrified fascination of rubberneckers at an accident scene. A few, those who'd worked closely with me, looked genuinely distressed. I could have argued, could have listed the millions I'd saved the company by negotiating favorable terms with suppliers who trusted me. Could have mentioned the 3 logistics crises I'd averted just in the past year. Instead, I closed my notebook, stood up, and straightened my jacket, the very pantsuit she'd mocked. Of course, Ms. Carson. I wish you the best of luck. My voice was steady, betraying none of the rage and humiliation churning inside me. As I walked toward the door, something made me turn back. Ivy was already moving on, discussing the next department slated for evolution. But I caught the sideways glances, the subtle shifting of bodies away from her. She might have won this battle, but she'd lost something more valuable, the loyalty of the room. I smiled then, a small, private smile, because I knew something Ivy Carson, with all her business school polish, had yet to learn. Companies aren't built on organizational charts and PowerPoint presentations. They're built on people. And she'd just alienated one of the few who could have helped her succeed. I walked out of Carson Enterprises for what I thought was the last time, carrying a box of personal items and something far more valuable. Every contact, every relationship, and every ounce of trust I'd earned over the past 12 years. What Ivy didn't realize was that she hadn't just fired an employee. She'd created a competitor. The first week after being fired was surprisingly peaceful. I spent mornings in my pajamas, sipping coffee on my balcony instead of rushing to catch the 6:45 train. Afternoons were dedicated to updating my resume, though my heart wasn't in it. 12 years at one company left a peculiar gap. I knew everything about Carson Enterprises' supply chain and almost nothing about navigating the modern job market. You should sue for wrongful termination, my sister Diane insisted over dinner. She humiliated you in front of everyone. I twirled pasta around my fork, considering it. I'd rather not spend the next year of my life in litigation. Then at least enjoy watching her fail, Diane said with a shrug. That company will collapse without you. I laughed it off, but part of me wondered. The logistics system I'd built was complex, deliberately so. It wasn't designed to be inherited. It was designed to be taught. Every supplier had specific requirements, quirks, and history that couldn't be captured in spreadsheet. Still, I expected Ivy's arrogance would carry her through the initial weeks. She had resources, her father's name, and whatever fancy MBA strategies she'd picked up. The company wouldn't implode overnight. I was wrong. 9 days after my unceremonious exit, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Miss Parker? This is Wei Zhang from Eastland Textiles. I sat up straighter. Eastland was our, Carson Enterprises' primary fabric supplier. Wei and I had worked together for 7 years. Wei, how are you? Is everything all right? His sigh carried across continents. Not exactly. There's a new purchasing manager who has canceled our standing order and is demanding a 30% price reduction for future business. My stomach tightened. 30%? That's impossible. Your margins are already razor thin. I tried explaining this, but she insists the new CEO requires cost-cutting across all vendors. She mentioned something about an AI system finding us inefficient. The disdain in his voice was palpable. What will you do? I asked, already knowing the answer. We cannot sustain such a reduction. I'm afraid we'll have to terminate our relationship with Carson. I wanted to give you the courtesy of knowing first, out of respect for our long partnership. After we hung up, I stared at my phone in disbelief. Eastland had been with Carson since the beginning. Their materials were in every product line. That call was just the first domino. By the end of the week, my phone had become a confessional for frustrated suppliers and former colleagues. Ivy had implemented a scorched earth approach to vendor management, demanding impossible price concessions while simultaneously insisting on faster deliveries. She'd replaced my team with fresh graduates who had analytics degrees but zero relationship experience. Marco from shipping operations texted me, "Remember that Brazilian woodworker who only communicates by fax?" New team tried to force him onto their portal system. He's pulled all his specialty timber from next quarter. I didn't reply immediately. Part of me felt vindicated, even smug. But another part ached for the company Richard had built, for the employees caught in the crossfire of his daughter's ego. 13 days after my firing, my former assistant Priya called in tears. "It's chaos, Miranda," she whispered, clearly hiding in a supply closet or bathroom. "The Thompson order is 3 weeks delayed. Customers are threatening to pull contracts. And the new logistics team keeps blaming inherited inefficiencies for everything." Meaning me, I translated. "Worse," Priya said. "Ivy held an all-hands meeting yesterday. Said the company was dealing with deliberate sabotage from, and I quote, disgruntled former employees who poisoned our supplier relationships on their way out." The accusation hit like a slap. She's blaming me? I didn't say a word to any supplier until they contacted me first. "Everyone who knows you understands that," Priya assured me. "But she needed a scapegoat, and you're convenient. There's more, though. She's calling an emergency board meeting next week. The Q2 projections look grim." After hanging up, I paced my apartment, anger and indignation giving way to a cold, calculated clarity. Ivy wasn't just incompetent. She was dangerous. Her recklessness threatened hundreds of jobs, including those of people who'd been kind to me for years. I sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop. Within minutes, I'd created a spreadsheet of every Carson supplier I'd heard was having issues. I added contact names, specific problems reported, and potential solutions. By midnight, the document was 17 pages long. I wasn't planning to intervene, not yet. But I'd learned from Richard Carson that preparation was everything. The next morning, I met Jacob for coffee. He'd been Carson's CFO for 15 years and my occasional ally in budget battles. Though he'd survived Ivy's initial culling, the strain showed in the new lines around his eyes. "How bad is it?" I asked without preamble. Jacob glanced around the coffee shop before answering. The Thompson delay triggered a contract penalty clause, $2.3 million. 3 major distributors have suspended orders pending supply chain stabilization, and suppliers are demanding prepayment due to relationship uncertainty. I winced. "Cash flow nightmare. Complete disaster," he confirmed. "And Ivy keeps throwing money at consultants who promise quick fixes." "Has she reached out to any of the original suppliers?" "Tried to repair relationships." Jacob's laugh was hollow. "She considers that admitting defeat. Besides, most suppliers won't even take her calls anymore. They say they'll only speak to..." He stopped abruptly. "To me?" I finished. He nodded, looking almost apologetic. "Your name keeps coming up, but Ivy's pride won't let her acknowledge that. Instead, she's spinning this narrative about you sabotaging the company out of spite." I shook my head, anger flaring again. "That's defamation." "It's desperation," Jacob corrected. "The board meeting is Tuesday. If she can't explain the logistics collapse and present a viable solution..." He let the sentence hang. As I walked home, my phone buzzed with a text from an anonymous number. "FYI, warehouse staff threatening walkout over new shift schedule. Ivy blames loyalty to old regime." Your name mentioned again. I stopped mid-stride, staring at the message. This had gone beyond professional ego or even righteous indignation. Ivy wasn't just attacking me. She was dismantling everything her father had built while blaming others for the destruction. That night, I added 3 more pages to my spreadsheet. Not out of vengeance, but from a growing certainty that sooner or later, someone from Carson Enterprises would come knocking on my door. I just never expected that someone would be Ivy herself. I didn't plan to spy on Carson Enterprises' emergency board meeting. But when Priya texted me the conference call details with a simple message, "You deserve to hear this," curiosity overwhelmed my better judgment. The meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m. Tuesday. I dialed in at 7:58, muted my phone, and listened as board members greeted each other with a forced cheerfulness of people anticipating disaster. "Let's hope this isn't as bad as the preliminary figures suggest," said Howard Weiss, the company's longest-serving board member and Richard's oldest friend. "My sources say it's worse," replied another voice I recognized as Elaine Chambers, a sharp-tongued venture capitalist who'd invested in Carson's early days. "Thompson is threatening a full contract pullout." I held my breath as Ivy joined the call. "Good morning, everyone. I appreciate you all making time for this situation update." Her voice projected confidence, but I'd spent enough time in corporate settings to recognize the faint tremor of someone on the defensive. For the next 20 minutes, Ivy presented what could only be described as a masterclass in corporate spin. Shipping delays became supply chain recalibrations. Vendor walkouts were strategic partnership realignments. Customer complaints represented opportunities for product improvement dialogue. The board's initial questions were cautious, probing. But as Ivy's responses grew increasingly evasive, the mood shifted perceptibly. "Let's cut to the chase," Elaine interrupted after a particularly vague explanation about inventory shortages. "The Thompson contract penalty is $2.3 million. 3 major distributors have suspended orders. And I'm hearing rumors of a potential warehouse staff walkout. This isn't a recalibration, it's a crisis." A heavy silence followed. "The situation is challenging," Ivy finally admitted. "But we're implementing solutions." "What solutions exactly?" This from Howard. "Because my sources tell me our primary textile supplier has terminated their relationship entirely after 12 years. Eastland was inefficient," Ivy countered. "Their pricing structure was. They were reliable," Howard cut in. "And now we're scrambling to source materials at 40% higher costs, with no guarantee of comparable quality." I could almost see Ivy squirming. "The logistics disruption is temporary. We're bringing in a specialized consulting team." "Another one?" Elaine's voice dripped with sarcasm. "That'll be the 3rd consulting group in 3 weeks. How much is this costing us?" "Investment in future efficiency is. It's $180,000 so far," interrupted a new voice, Jacob, the CFO. His tone was apologetic, but firm. "Plus another $250,000 committed for the new supply chain software implementation." The collective intake of breath was audible. I pressed my hand against my mouth to stifle a gasp. That was more than my department's entire technology budget for 5 years. Nearly $500,000 on consultants while we're hemorrhaging customers? Howard sounded incredulous. "Richard would never. I am not my father." Ivy's voice had hardened. His methods were becoming outdated. "Carson Enterprises needs modern solutions. It needs to survive the quarter," Elaine shot back. "Your father built this company on relationships and reliability. In 3 weeks, you've managed to destroy both." The conversation devolved further as board members demanded increasingly specific explanations for decisions that clearly had no strategic foundation. As Ivy's responses grew more defensive, I found myself wincing in secondhand embarrassment. Then came the question I'd been waiting for. "Why did you fire Miranda Parker?" asked Howard. The call went so quiet I checked to make sure I was still connected. "Parker was resistant to necessary changes," Ivy replied, her composure slipping. "Her methods were. She managed our entire supply chain without a single major disruption for over a decade," Howard pressed. "Now, 3 weeks after her departure, we're facing a logistics apocalypse. That seems like quite a coincidence." "It's not a coincidence." Ivy's voice had risen slightly. "There's evidence of deliberate supplier sabotage." My fingers tightened around my phone. This was defamation, pure and simple. "Evidence?" Elaine demanded. "What evidence?" Multiple suppliers have refused to work with our new team. They're suddenly imposing impossible conditions. It's clearly coordinated. Jacob cleared his throat. I've spoken with several of these suppliers myself. They claim they're simply enforcing the terms Miranda negotiated years ago, terms we've apparently been violating since she left. Another silence, this one humming with tension. Is this true? Howard asked quietly. There may have been some misunderstandings about existing arrangements, Ivy admitted. But that only proves my point about outdated systems. Nothing was properly documented. I nearly laughed out loud. Everything was documented, in my meticulous handwritten notes, my email archives, and most importantly, in the relationships I'd cultivated. The system wasn't designed to be hostile to newcomers, but it did require something Ivy fundamentally lacked: respect for what came before her. The board needs to consider interim leadership options, Elaine said bluntly. This situation cannot continue. You can't be serious. Ivy sounded genuinely shocked. I've only had 3 weeks. 3 weeks in which company valuation has dropped 18%, Jacob noted quietly. What followed was 20 minutes of increasingly heated debate. Ivy proposed more consultants, more software, more restructuring. The board demanded immediate stabilization and restoration of key supplier relationships. Maybe we should reach out to Miranda, Howard suggested, not for the first time. Ask her to consult. Absolutely not. Ivy's response was immediate and vehement. She's part of the problem, not the solution. The meeting ended with an ultimatum. Ivy had 1 week to present a viable recovery plan, or the board would reevaluate her position. As I hung up, my phone immediately buzzed with a text from Priya. Well, what do you think? I stared at the message, emotions warring within me. Vindication, yes, but also genuine concern for the company and its employees. I typed back, she's drowning and still refusing a life vest. Think she'll call you? Priya asked. Never, I replied confidently. Her pride would never allow it. I was wrong about that, too. 3 days after the board meeting, I accepted a consulting position with Meridian Logistics, a nimble startup eager to leverage my expertise. The salary was modest compared to Carson Enterprises, but the work environment was refreshingly drama-free. My new colleagues valued experience over flashy credentials, and the CEO, a woman in her 50s who'd built the company from nothing, reminded me of Richard in all the best ways. I was just settling into my new office when Janet, Meridian's receptionist, poked her head in. There's someone online too, who's been calling all morning. Says it's urgent. Did they give a name? No, but she sounds desperate. Curious, I picked up the phone. Miranda Parker speaking. A beat of silence then. Miranda, this is Ivy Carson. My hand froze on the receiver. Of all the scenarios I'd imagined for this inevitable moment, none had prepared me for the reality of hearing her voice again, especially not a voice so different from the one that had dismissed me as dead weight 3 weeks earlier. Miss Carson, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. This is unexpected. Thunder rumbled outside my window, matching the storm I imagined was brewing inside Ivy. The forecast had predicted rain all day, a fitting backdrop for this conversation. She faltered, then tried again. I'm calling to discuss a potential consultation arrangement. I leaned back in my chair, allowing myself a small, private smile. A consultation? Regarding what exactly? Another pause. I could almost hear her pride wrestling with necessity. Regarding our current supply chain challenges, she finally managed, each word sounding painfully extracted. The board feels your insight might be valuable during this transition period. The board feels this way, I repeated. And you? The silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. Then, barely audible. I believe your experience could be beneficial. Not quite an admission that she'd made a catastrophic mistake, but as close as her ego would allow. I considered ending her misery, telling her I'd think about it, and hanging up. But curiosity got the better of me. What specifically do you need help with? I asked, knowing full well the extent of the chaos unfolding at Carson. What followed was as close to a confession as I'd ever hear from Ivy Carson. Suppliers weren't just refusing new terms, They were canceling existing orders. The warehouse systems had been upgraded, with software that couldn't interface with their inventory management. 3 key logistics managers had quit without notice, leaving critical shipments in limbo. Leong from Q-Tech won't even take my calls, she admitted, referring to Carson's most crucial electronics supplier. His assistant said he'll only speak to you. Liang's son is starting college this fall, I replied. Stanford. Engineering program. I sent him a congratulations card last month. A card? Ivy repeated flatly. Relationships aren't built on contract terms, Miss Carson. They're built on 1,000 small courtesies extended over years. Rain began to drum against my window, gentle at first, then with increasing insistence, much like the pressure Ivy must have been feeling. The board is meeting again on Monday, she said, an edge of desperation creeping into her voice. I need to present a stabilization plan. Without the supply chain functioning, we'll lose the Westridge contract. That's 22% of our annual revenue. I knew the Westridge numbers intimately. I negotiated that contract myself 2 years ago. Its loss would be devastating, not just for Ivy, but for hundreds of employees who'd done nothing wrong. What exactly are you proposing? I asked. A consulting agreement. Short term. She named a figure that made me raise my eyebrows, considerably more than I'd been making as an employee, just to help rebuild vendor relationships and get operations back on track. I tapped my pen against my desk, weighing my options. Part of me, the part still smarting from public humiliation, wanted to decline outright. Another part felt a responsibility to Richard's legacy and to the colleagues who'd become friends over the years. I'll need to think about it, I said finally. I've just accepted a position with another company. I can't simply... Please. The words seemed to pain her physically. Just one meeting. Tomorrow. Hear the full proposal before deciding. I glanced at the framed photo on my new desk, a group shot from Carson's holiday party 2 years ago. Richard stood in the center, arm around my shoulders, both of us laughing at some forgotten joke. Around us clustered the logistics team I'd built, people who'd trusted my leadership. One meeting, I agreed. No promises beyond that. The relief in her voice was palpable. Thank you. My office. 9 a.m. Not your office, I corrected. Neutral ground. The Capitol Grill on 5th noon. She hesitated then. Fine. Noon. After hanging up, I sat motionless, processing what had just happened. The woman who'd so confidently dismissed me was now practically begging for my help. The satisfaction was undeniable, but oddly hollow. I called my new boss at Meridian, explaining the situation. To my surprise, she encouraged me to take the meeting. Carson is bleeding out, she said pragmatically. Either you help them and come back with even more industry credibility, or you don't, and we potentially pick up their clients when they fold. Win-win for us. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Ivy's dismissive words from that fateful meeting, dead weight in a pantsuit, then contrasting them with her desperate phone call. The shift was so dramatic it almost inspired pity. Almost. By morning, I'd made my decision. I would meet with Ivy, but not as a supplicant grateful for another chance. If I returned to Carson Enterprises, it would be entirely on my terms. I selected my outfit carefully, a charcoal pantsuit, similar to the one I'd worn the day Ivy fired me, but paired with a deep crimson blouse that Richard once said brought out my confidence. I wasn't dressing to impress. I was armoring myself for battle. As I headed toward the restaurant, rain still falling in sheets, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't going to this meeting seeking revenge. The company's failure wouldn't satisfy me. Too many innocent people would be hurt in the process. No, what I wanted was recognition, acknowledgement of my value, and perhaps, just perhaps, the chance to rescue what Richard Carson had spent his life building, not for his daughter's sake, but for his. The Capitol Grill buzzed with the typical lunchtime crowd, power suits and expense accounts, deals being sealed over rare steaks and mineral water. I arrived 15 minutes early, requesting a corner table with a view of the entrance. Some battles are won before they begin, and positioning matters. Ivy arrived precisely at noon, looking nothing like the imperious figure who'd fired me. Her designer suit was immaculate as ever, but dark circles shadowed her eyes, poorly concealed by makeup. Her shoulders, once thrown back in performative confidence, now carried the visible weight of a failing company. She spotted me and crossed the restaurant with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I didn't stand. "Miranda, thank you for coming." She extended her hand. I shook it briefly, noting her grip was firmer than necessary, a small, desperate attempt to project authority she no longer possessed. "Miss Carson," I replied, gesturing to the seat across from me. The waiter appeared immediately. I ordered a salad and iced tea. "Ivy, just coffee." "Not hungry?" I asked. "Busy morning," she replied vaguely. "The Westridge situation is escalating." I nodded, unsurprised. "They're threatening to invoke the non-performance clause?" Her surprise that I knew this was evident. "Yes. They've given us until Friday to resolve the shipping delays." 3 days, I mused. Ambitious timeline. "Impossible timeline," she corrected, then caught herself. "Without assistance, that is." I took a slow sip of water, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. Finally, "Why me, Miss Carson? Surely a revolutionary leader like yourself could find any number of logistics experts eager to help." The barb landed. Her jaw tightened momentarily before she responded. "The board specifically requested you. They feel your historical knowledge would be valuable during this transition." "The board," I repeated. "Not you." Our drinks arrived, giving her a moment to collect herself. When she responded, her voice was quieter, almost resigned. "Fine. I need your help. The suppliers won't talk to me or my team. The warehouse staff are threatening to walk, and the board is considering emergency leadership changes if I can't present a viable recovery plan by Monday." There it was, the real reason for this meeting. Not concern for the company, but fear for her position. "And you think I can fix all this in 3 days?" "I think you're the only one who can." The admission clearly cost her. "Name your price." I leaned back, studying her. In that moment, despite her youth and wealth and pedigree, I pitied her. She'd been thrust into her father's role without his wisdom, his patience, or his humility. "It's not about price," I said finally. "It's about terms." I reached into my bag and withdrew a document I'd prepared that morning. 5 pages, professionally bound. Pushing it across the table, I continued. "My consulting proposal. You should read it carefully before deciding." Frowning slightly, Ivy flipped through the pages. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to barely contained outrage. You can't be serious," she sputtered. "Full operational authority over logistics for 6 months? Final approval on all vendor relationships? Triple your previous salary as a consulting fee?" I met her gaze steadily. "Those are my terms. This would essentially make you co-CEO for half the company's operations." "Not at all," I corrected. "You'd remain CEO. I'd simply be an independent consultant with specific authority parameters." "The board would never approve this." I smiled thinly. "Call them and find out." Her hand trembled slightly as she set down the document. "Why are you doing this? Is it revenge? Humiliating me the way you felt humiliated?" The question caught me off guard. For a brief moment, Ivy Carson looked vulnerable, human rather than corporate. "This isn't about humiliation," I said quietly. "It's about respect. For the relationships I built. For the system that worked. For the company your father created." "My father's company," she repeated, a flash of genuine grief crossing her features. "Everyone keeps reminding me it's his company. His legacy. His vision." For the first time, I glimpsed what it must be like to be Ivy Carson, forever measured against a man whose shoes she couldn't possibly fill. "It could be your company too," I offered, softening slightly. "But not by tearing down everything he built. Not by dismissing the value of experience. And certainly not by treating people as disposable." Our food arrived, though neither of us seemed particularly interested in eating. Ivy stared at my proposal, her internal struggle written across her face. "If I agree to this," she said finally, How do I know you won't use this position to undermine me completely? To turn the board against me? You don't, I answered honestly. Just as I have no guarantee you won't try to push me out again the moment the crisis passes. We'd be operating on something revolutionary in business. I paused. Trust. The irony wasn't lost on her. A small, reluctant smile tugged at her lips. My father would appreciate that. She pulled out her phone, dialed a number, and put it on speaker. Howard, I'm sitting with Miranda Parker. She's willing to help, but her terms are substantial. Howard's relief was audible. Whatever she wants, Ivy. The Westridge situation alone. Full operational authority over logistics. Final vendor approval. Triple her previous compensation as a consulting fee. A brief pause, then. Done. I'll call an emergency session to formalize it this afternoon. Ivy's expression was unreadable as she ended the call. It seems you'll be returning to Carson Enterprises, Miss Parker. As a consultant. I corrected. Not an employee. The next morning, I walked through Carson's lobby for the first time since being fired. Conversations halted mid-sentence as employees noticed me. Some looked shocked, others relieved, a few openly pleased. Priya spotted me from across the atrium and nearly dropped her coffee in excitement. News travels fast in corporate settings, but even faster in desperate ones. By the time I reached the executive floor, at least a dozen people had whispered some version of "she's back" into phones or to colleagues. Ivy was waiting in the conference room, surrounded by board members and department heads. The tension was thick enough to cut. Ms. Parker has agreed to help us address our current challenges, she announced, her voice carefully controlled. She'll be consulting on logistics operations effective immediately. Howard smiled broadly. Welcome back, Miranda. Thank you, I replied, setting my briefcase on the table. Let's be clear from the start. I'm not here to assign blame or revisit past decisions. I'm here to stabilize operations and restore vendor relationships. I pulled out my laptop and opened it. Now, if you'll excuse us, Ms. Carson and I have some difficult calls to make. As the room cleared, Ivy remained seated, watching me warily. When we were alone, she asked, "How bad is it really?" I met her gaze directly. Worse than you know, but not irreparable. For a brief moment, naked relief crossed her face. Then she nodded crisply, her CEO mask sliding back into place. Then let's get to work. The first week was brutal. 18-hour days fueled by coffee and determination. I made 57 calls to suppliers in the first 48 hours alone, each conversation requiring a delicate balance of apology, reassurance, and negotiation. Ivy shadowed me through it all, watching with a mixture of resentment and grudging respect as I navigated relationships she dismissed as unnecessary. She winced visibly during my call with Liang from QTech, who spent 15 minutes venting his frustration before agreeing to resume shipments, but only after I personally guaranteed quality control oversight. How did you remember his son's scholarship details? Ivy asked afterward, clearly baffled. I didn't have to remember. I cared enough to write it down. I slid a worn leather journal across the desk. 12 years of notes on every major supplier. Birthdays, family milestones, personal interests, past issues. This is what outdated methods look like. She flipped through pages of meticulous handwriting, her expression unreadable. This is comprehensive. It's relationship management, I corrected. Something algorithms can't replace. By the end of the second week, we'd stabilized the immediate crisis. Shipments were moving again. Westridge had cautiously renewed their contract with revised terms. The warehouse staff, satisfied with the return of predictable scheduling, had called off their threatened walkout. The board was ecstatic. Howard called it a logistics miracle during the update meeting. Ivy sat silently as I presented the recovery metrics, her face a careful mask. It was after that meeting, alone in the elevator, that she finally spoke what had clearly been on her mind. They all look at you like you're the real CEO. I studied her reflection in the polished doors. They look at me like someone who solved a problem. That's all. You're enjoying this, she accused quietly. My failure. Their approval. The elevator stopped at my floor. Before exiting, I turned to face her. What I enjoy is seeing Richard's company survive. What surprises me is that you still don't understand why. The third week brought a different kind of challenge. With immediate fires extinguished, we had to address the structural damage Ivy's hasty changes had caused. I proposed a hybrid system, integrating the valuable parts of her modernization efforts with the relationship-based approach that had worked for years. To my surprise, she didn't immediately object. Instead, she asked thoughtful questions about implementation timelines and training requirements. "Your father used to do that," I observed after one particularly productive session. "Do what?" "Listen before deciding." He didn't assume newer automatically meant better. Something flashed in her eyes. Pain or recognition. I couldn't tell which. "Everyone thinks I didn't know him," she said quietly. "That I was too busy with my own life to understand his. But I did. I just thought." She trailed off, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter now." "What did you think?" I pressed, genuinely curious. She met my gaze directly. "I thought his success came despite his old-fashioned methods, not because of them. I thought I could do better. Faster. More efficiently." A bitter smile twisted her lips. I was spectacularly wrong. It was the closest thing to an apology I would likely ever receive. The fourth week marked a turning point. With a new hybrid system in place and supplier relationships largely repaired, operations had not just stabilized, they were improving. Delivery times were down 12%. Inventory costs had decreased without sacrificing quality. Even the warehouse staff reported higher satisfaction with the modified scheduling algorithm. "The board wants to extend your consulting agreement," Ivy told me one evening as we reviewed the monthly metrics. "Another 6 months, same terms." I looked up, studying her carefully. "And you? What do you want?" She hesitated, choosing her words with uncharacteristic care. "I want what's best for the company." "That's not an answer." "Fine." She set down her pen. "You're good at this. Better than anyone I could hire. The company needs you. Logically, I should want you to stay. But emotionally?" Her gaze was steady. "Emotionally, it's difficult to have a daily reminder of my worst mistake." I nodded, appreciating her honesty. "I understand that. But here's something to consider. Staying in your father's shadow was never going to work. Neither was trying to erase everything he built. The real challenge, the one worthy of you, is figuring out how to honor his legacy while creating your own." As the 6-month mark of my consulting agreement approached, I had already made my decision. Meridian Logistics had offered me a permanent position as Chief Operations Officer, complete autonomy, equity in the company, and a seat on their board. It was an opportunity one couldn't refuse. I prepared a detailed transition plan for Carson, including recommendations for my replacement and a 3-month implementation timeline. When I placed it on Ivy's desk, her expression told me she already knew what it contained. "You're not staying," she said. "Not a question. I have another opportunity." She nodded slowly. I expected this, but hoped. She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "What would it take to keep you? Name your terms. Director of Operations? Board position?" "It's not about terms this time," I said gently. "It's about the right fit. This is your company now, Ivy. You're ready to lead it your way." Surprise flickered across her face. "You really believe that?" "I do. You've learned more in 6 months than most executives learn in years. The mistakes you made, they taught you what your father could never explain." On my last day, the logistics department threw a small farewell gathering. Priya made an embarrassing speech about my mentorship. Jacob presented me with a framed photo of the entire team. Even Howard stopped by with well wishes and not-so-subtle hints about board positions in the future. Ivy appeared as the party was winding down. Our goodbye was brief, but surprisingly genuine. As I gathered my belongings for the final time, she walked me to the elevator. "I underestimated you," she said suddenly, her voice low. "That first day. I saw the pantsuit and the paper files and made assumptions that cost this company millions." I smiled, thinking of how far we'd both come since that fateful meeting. "You fired the wrong person," I agreed. "But thank you. It only made me more valuable." The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside, turning to face her one last time. Your father would be proud, I added. Not of what you did, but of what you learned from it. As the doors closed between us, I saw something I never expected to see on Ivy Carson's face. Not resentment or rivalry, but respect. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from our most painful mistakes. And sometimes getting fired is just the beginning of becoming irreplaceable.